On today's Newsmakers, country star Granger Smith, a Christian baker under fire, and a modern-day underground railroad. That and more coming up. Welcome to Newsmakers, a show where we go behind the headlines each week to bring you interviews with pastors, entertainers, politicians, and other notable figures. On today's Newsmakers, we start out with country star Granger Smith. He recently left performing behind to pursue Christian ministry. He's sitting down with me and CBN's Trey Goins-Phillips to tell his incredible story. Let's welcome Granger to Newsmakers. So Granger, you have out a new memoir. It's called Like a River. What was it like to open yourself up in such a personal way through book form?
Well, that's a good question, considering for so many years I did that through song form, 3 minutes at a time. But, writing songs, I could be much more vague, and the song could have a deeper meaning, but I don't have to really go there. I could just kind of have an analogy of the situation I'm going through, and that might be enough for me to emotionally pour myself out into a song, but still kind of keep it vague. You can't do that with a book. You have to go into very specific detail. In fact, the more detail, the better. That's the essence of writing a book. So it was quite an experience, and a good one. It was a good experience. It was a good form of healing for me. It wasn't hard to do. Just practically, it wasn't hard to do. It was difficult emotionally, but practically, it was all in the front of my brain and was able to come out pretty easy.
Something I think is so fascinating about your story is, one, you've had to deal with a lot of grief and a lot of sorrow, and navigating that as somebody who's in a public sphere, right? People are watching you, and you're kind of having to go through, for better or for worse, this grieving process of losing a son publicly in front of everybody. Can you talk a little bit about how you navigated some of that sorrow as you continued to write music and you continued to perform? Because I know my propensity, I'm sure, would be just to stuff it down.
Yeah, that's my say with me. It's, I had a feeling that if I could help somebody else that's struggling, by telling my story and by showing strength, if I could do that, then it felt good, because people would say, I've been struggling for a long time, but to see you and to see your courage and strength, that's really helped me. And then I would think, oh, that's good. That means it's working. But that's just a facade that can only really last for so long. You can only do that for so long, although it feels good and it's part of healing to help others. I can only do that for so long before, I just wanted to hide in a cave for a long time and stop being in the public eye. But that was my job. That's what was paying the bills and 12 other guys' salaries. So I just had to learn how to deal with that.
Something that you mentioned earlier in our conversation was about how intellectually it was an easier task to write the book, but emotionally it was a really taxing thing to do, obviously, because you're kind of bearing your soul and sending this out where everybody can now have an inside look into that process of grief and sorrow and all of that. Was there something in that process that was exposed to you that maybe surprised you about your own feelings or about your own perspective of the Lord?
Well, as I wrote the story, I didn't exactly know where it was going or how it was unfolding, but the book's called Like a River, and so the first chapter, it starts with losing my son to drowning in my backyard when I was there with him. And so for a lot of times, as I was talking about writing the book, and people would say, well, you're writing a book, what's it about? And I would say, well, it's about losing my son. And they would say, oh, I heard about that. I'm so sorry. And as I continued to write, I learned, oh, that's not really what this book is about. It's really not. I mean, that's how it opens, and that's the catalyst to it. That's how the curtain opens, really. But it's about me dying and me being reborn and the new path that followed. And one of the things that opened up in that rebirth was my son Maverick, who was born. And Maverick really takes over as the star of the show. by the end of the book, you realize that River got the title and he gets the credit of the cover, but really Maverick that's the star of that book. And so it is so much more than this is a book about losing my son, which is what I used to say.
You know, we asked you this and you spoke to it a little bit at the top, but as we round out to a close, as a final question, you know, when you put a book together, a lot of heart goes into that, a lot of personal sort of effort goes into it, as it did in this case. What is your end goal? If you could have one feeling or thought that you could be leaving readers with when they finish the book and put it down, what would that be?
Well, in the book, in chapter 8, it's the story of my rebirth. And what happened to me was as I was after rock bottom and searching and trying to figure out how to heal and how to find redemption myself. And I was reborn through listening to a sermon on YouTube as I was driving in my truck. The pastor was speaking out of John chapter 14, and I kind of unfolded that whole scenario as it went down, and the way that the sun was in the sky, and the feeling of the steering wheel in my hands, and the mile marker I was traveling past as I heard that sermon, and as I felt everything change, and as my eyes were opened and my ears were open, and I felt all of that happen to me in that moment in the truck. And then I think goals for the book would be that moment. If the Lord could use the book for someone in a moment like I had for them, and maybe I remember the page I turned, I remember where I was sitting, and I remember the emotional state I was in when I read the words that changed everything, that opened my eyes. If Lord willing, that my book could be that moment in the truck for me, for someone else, just one person, that it's absolutely worth all the effort.
Well, Granger, I really appreciate you taking the time, taking us through your story. And again, the book is Like a River. People can go out and grab it wherever books are sold. Thanks for your time today.
Thank you guys so much. I sure appreciate you.
You can follow along with Granger's journey at grangersmith.com. Up next, a Christian baker under fire after refusing to make a same-sex wedding cake is now refusing to back down. This is Newsmakers on the CBN News Channel. Welcome back to Newsmakers on CBN News Channel. Our next guest is Kathy Miller. She's the owner of Tastries Bakery out in Bakersfield, California, and she is locked in a legal battle with California officials after refusing to make a gay wedding cake back in 2017. But Kathy says she won't back down, even if that means going all the way to the Supreme Court with her battle. Let's welcome her to Newsmakers. Kathy, your case has continued to progress, and the state of California appealing the latest victory that you had. Before we get into all of that, can you take us through how this case all began? How did you end up in the legal crosshairs?
Thank you, Billy. About 6.5 years ago, we had 4 people come in, and it was 2 men and 2 women, and I thought it was a bride and a groom and their best man and maid of honor. They asked to have a wedding cake made, and once I realized that it was a same-sex union, I politely told them that I'm sorry, I can't hurt my Lord and Savior. I can't participate in the union, but that I had a bakery that was very happy to do their cake. And so we thought everything was fine, and everything was not fine. Social media went crazy. The media went crazy. We had harassments and horrible emails, and just really a very difficult 2 years. And then we were represented by the Thomas More Society. We went to court. There was TROs, and we ended up winning. And then the state decided that wasn't good enough, and in comes the Beckett team, and they are taking care of us now legally.
So you have been in a years-long battle now over what I assume you thought would be a very simple interaction that day. And as you said, I just want to emphasize this, when they came to you, you said to them, I have another bakery. I'm going to actually forward you to somebody else who would have no problem doing this, correct?
Correct. And it also violated my standards of service, which had been in effect for several years.
What was it like for you in October, after years now of being in this, to hear, oh no, the state is going to be appealing this again? What was that like for you?
Well, we had one day to rejoice and celebrate and praise the Lord. And then the state of California just popped that bubble. And it was very disappointing. But you know what? When God calls you to walk a path, you walk it. And we know that with his support and his wisdom, we'll continue to walk the path he has for us.
You know, Kathy, people, and you've heard this because you mentioned the emails and the calls and you know, threats. I'm sure you faced all sorts of things, and we'll talk about that, you know, in a moment. But, you know, when you think about what people will say, okay, Kathy, you're a bigot, you're horrible, you won't serve the LGBTQ, community. We've heard all these things. Can you correct the record on that? Help people understand, because I don't think that's the case at all. This was about this particular incident, not serving LGBTQ people.
You're correct. So this is not about not serving someone at all. We have LGBT community people who come in my bakery all the time. So I'm happy to serve everyone. This issue is I can't participate in the union of an LGBT couple because it goes against my Lord and Savior. I'm not going to hurt Jesus. And I told them that. So that's what the issue is for me. Now, the state should be supporting me, or at least have talked to me about it and interviewed me, because that's my constitutional right to live my life for the Lord if that's what I choose.
Sure. And you've been doing, I mean, you've been baking for a long time now, and you've built this business. You talked about, again, and we just mentioned some of those responses you've gotten. How has this case over the last 6 years impacted your business and even you personally as a human being?
It's been a complete roller coaster, both physically and emotionally and financially. It really, our business took a big dive when this happened. It's hurt my time with my family. It's taken a lot of time out of that. But, you know, when you're doing something for the Lord and when you love Jesus with all your heart, then you're going to walk that path. Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, that's the struggle in the midst of this, you know, as you're trying to navigate it, and you're navigating it publicly. And that's a whole other level, you know, all of that reaction that you mentioned getting, you know, in most cases, people aren't dealing with those things, but here you are really dealing with absolutely so much on this. And, you know, we appreciate you taking the time. At the end of the day, when all is said and done, Kathy, what are you hoping to see happen in this case?
I'm hoping to see that business people, everyone in their walk of life, can walk according to their convictions. And for me, it's my love for Jesus, and that the government will honor that and respect that and try to work with us, and understanding that it's okay to have those beliefs, and our Constitution does support that.
Well, Kathy, I so appreciate you taking the time today and joining us, and we'll be continuing to pray for you throughout this journey.
Thank you so much.
We'll continue to cover Kathy's story as it unfolds, and we'll be back on the other side of the break with a look at one ministry's incredible effort to save 100,000 Sudanese slaves. This is Newsmakers on the CBN News Channel. Welcome back to Newsmakers. For our final segment, we are sitting down with Joel Veldkamp, Head of International Communications at Christian Solidarity International. Now, he's going to be telling us about an incredible modern-day underground railroad. This is an effort that has saved 100,000 people from captivity. Let's welcome Joel to Newsmakers. Joel, your organization, Christian Solidarity International, has been assisting for a long time now in the rescue of slaves in South Sudan. Now, before we get into the work that you guys have been doing there, can you explain the situation there when it comes to this issue of slavery?
Yeah, so I think the most important thing to start with is today we have two countries, Sudan and South Sudan. But in the 1980s and 1990s, it was all just one country called Sudan. And that country was split by a civil war between the north, which is mostly Muslim and dominated by Arabs, and the south, which is mostly Christian and Black African. And during that war, the northern Muslim government used slavery as a weapon of war against the South. So tens of thousands, over 100,000 people were enslaved by jihadist forces during that war, and they've been left behind. You know, the war ended in 2005, but they're still stuck there. So what we do is try to get them out.
And I would imagine a chunk of these people, a solid proportion based on what you just broke down, would be Christians, non-Muslims. I assume some Muslims probably in there as well, but a good chunk of them being Christians.
Yeah, they're virtually all Christians or followers of indigenous religions in South Sudan.
Well, it's heartbreaking to consider that people have been left behind. When you said that, I thought, my goodness, 2005, and yet, it ends there, but this suffering does not end for these slaves. I want to get into some trips that you took there in a moment, but before we do that, can you take us through what we know of the day in the life of a slave there? What does slavery look like?
Yeah, I mean, the nightmare really begins when the abduction happened during the war. So these were usually attacks on villages by raiders on horseback or on camels. Sometimes they came in trains, and they would force people into a cargo car of a train and take them back into the north. And at that time, you would see lots of people being killed, lots of people being brutalized, trying to break down the spirit of the people before they're enslaved. From what we've heard from the people who we've met after they come out of slavery, life in the North is really full of violence and daily terror. For women, sexual abuse is rampant, unfortunately. All of these people who are enslaved are not allowed to practice Christianity. A lot of the boys especially are forced to convert to Islam and practice Islam. Beatings are basically a daily affair. And it's just the threat of overwhelming violence hangs over these people at every moment, right? So I've talked to people who their master tried to kill them with a knife after they lost a cow, right? Or I talked to a little boy who once ran away instead of washing the dishes like his master wanted him to, and his master cut off his pinky finger. I mean, these are just that threat of overwhelming violence, and no one can protect you. That's how I would describe it. Violence.
I think through what it must be like for somebody to be in captivity for 20 years, right? And then to not know where your family is. Maybe family have passed away. You're starting entirely fresh, a whole new life after this rescue, and you have no idea what you're coming back to. And, that is just, it's heartbreaking, but it's amazing to hear that you guys are helping set them up with resources, helping them start that life over again. And also the other thing you mentioned that really stands out to me, quite often in these circumstances, when you're in the outside, you might look in and say you have an issue of radical extremism driving this initially when you go back to the history you mentioned. And yet you have these people, whether they're Christians or Muslims, and you mentioned the one Muslim man who they're going out of their way to risk their lives and their family. You think about his mother, to help other people who they know have been trapped in this. And so just the complexities and the layers of this are really just incredible to hear. How can people help out? There may be people learning about this for the first time. They want to know more information. They want to help. What are the best ways they can go about doing that?
Yeah, absolutely. The best way is to go to our website. It's www.csi-usa.org. And make a donation as much as you're able to. The cattle vaccine that we exchange for people's freedom is usually about $50 per person, which is just a mind-blowing sum whenever I think about it. And it costs more money, to supply them with food and a goat and other supplies when they come back, and with medical treatment. But we usually say it's around $250 per person to get a person all the way from slavery in North Sudan back to their homeland in South Sudan.
And I encourage people to do that. One last question for you. As you heard these stories and as you've continued to hear them over the years, what has struck you about the faith, particularly of the Christians here, who have, I would assume many of them held on to their faith, as you were mentioning, they've clung to it. specifically on the faith front, what has most resonated with you?
Yeah, I think I'm thinking of one young man I met named Garang, who was just old enough when he was enslaved to know that he didn't come from a Muslim background, but not old enough to really know anything about Christianity at all. So he grew up in slavery, and he grew up being forced to learn the Quran and go to Islamic school at night and work during the day, always being told he was a Muslim, always being forced to pray like a Muslim. But he always resisted, and he never accepted that this was his identity. And then when he came back to South Sudan, he had the chance for the first time to learn what it meant to be a Christian. And he learned the Jesus story. And he told me, the Jesus story is way better. the Jesus came and he gave himself for the world. He doesn't force anyone to follow him. He doesn't force anyone to worship him. He just loves us. And I carried that around with me, that because I've grown up in a Christian household. I always kind of knew the story, and I confess that sometimes it gets a little passé for me if I don't stop to think about it or meditate on it. But for him, he was encountering it for the first time. And it just, that experience of understanding that grace for the first time. I always carried that around with me. It was a real blessing.
Well, yeah, it's powerful to hear stories like that. And I'd encourage people to head over to the website, as you said, get involved, and also be praying, because we need to be aware of these situations, and we need to be turning to prayer for those who are still in captivity, and also for those who are starting new lives, and for your organization, CSI, for the wonderful work you do. Appreciate your time today, Joel.
Thank you, Billy. God bless you.
For more information on CSI's incredible effort, go to csi-usa.org. We'll be right back in just a moment with more Newsmakers. That's all for today's Newsmakers. Thank you for watching, and be sure to head over to the CBN News YouTube channel for the full interviews you saw on today's episode. Plus, you can check out our new daily Newsmakers podcast. We feature one full interview every single day. Be sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast platform, and we'll see you here on the show again next week.